Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you a late season tour of my garden. I'm going to start off in the front garden and then I'll go off in towards the back garden. So there's been a lot of changes in this garden since the first tour. The first tour was about a year ago. Pretty much this was a blank canvas, just empty lawn at the front here and a couple of shrubs with stepping stones to the front door. So what I've done here is I've put in some slabs, nice wide path so I can easily get through, and I've edged it with some roofing tiles or roofing slate just to hold the beds back. The beds will be slightly higher in the future. I need to raise them a little bit more. Basically I've got some more digging to do on the side of the drive. But that's basically the hard landscaping features I've done in the front here. So as I say, it was originally grass. I've done a video which I'll put a link in now to see how I dug it over and improved the soil, got it ready for planting. But basically these are rose beds. I've still got one more rose to plant and a couple of trees, but these beds are getting close to how they should look eventually. So at the front here I've got a couple of Ricinus plants. I'll go through all the Ricinus plants in my garden. These were actually planted in springtime, and I did a video about them in spring where I planted them from seed, and they've grown really well. These aren't perennial however, so these will die down as soon as we get the first frost, but they're looking really nice. And I'll just add, I'm filming this at the end of October, so that the temperatures are really getting quite cold now. We've had a couple of light frosts and so far they've been okay, but it won't be much longer until the hard frosts come and we actually start losing some of the plants from the frost. So most of the damage you'll see on the plants is actually from the wind. Normally here in North Scotland I'd expect to have a killing frost around about September time, but we've had a very mild autumn and it's late October and there still hasn't been a hard frost, so most of the tropicals are still doing surprisingly well. I have replaced a lot of the bedding plants already with winter bedding plants because I was worried about the frost coming, and I'll make a video about that soon and I'll put a link in once that's uploaded. But bedding wise, what I've got in this bed at the moment is a mixture of pansies. So I've got a whole line of pansies along both sides of the bed. You can see them all going along there. They're just starting to come into flower. And then I've also interspersed that with a few wallflowers. The wallflowers, they won't actually flower till spring, and that's these ones here. And I've also put lots of crocuses around the bottom of the roses, and I'll be doing an update video on them in springtime once they're in flower. So the idea with this front bed is it's mainly going to be roses. At the front there will be two large laburnum trees. At the moment I've got the Ricinus plants in here just for something to fill the space, but this is where the two large laburnums will be, and they'll be basically by this hedge. So I'm going to be making an archway with laburnum, so it'll be nice yellow flowers in spring, and that'll be what will be at the front here. Then going forward it's a mixture of roses. I've gone through the roses in more detail in a previous video, and as this is a whole garden tour I won't go through each rose individually because it'll take too long. But basically it's a real mixture of red and yellow roses, and they're all quite disease resistant, and also they're fragrant as well. So some of them are doing better than others. This one is called Fragrant Cloud. This one's already lost all its leaves. It is quite late in the year though, so it's not too surprising. You can also see coming along here the Pelargoniums are doing really well. They'll survive down to about -2, -3, so I'm not too worried about them for at least another couple of weeks. And we've got other roses such as Deep Secret Rose down here. Now I will also have another rose in this section. This is for now just a dahlia, just temporarily. I'll put a rose in there later on. And the idea is to have summer bedding plants underneath all the roses. So going forward we've got this rose, which is one of my favourites, which is actually Arthur Bell rose. It's nice and fragrant. It's floribunda rose, so it flowers all the time. It's always got really nice glossy healthy foliage, but usually this year, even though it's the same variety, the one I planted over here has been hit quite badly with black spot. Normally this rose variety doesn't get too badly affected by black spot, but we did have a very damp October, a lot of rain, a lot of damp conditions, and that seems to have made the black spot worse than normal, because normally the Arthur Bell rose isn't really too susceptible to disease. So as we get to the end of the bed here, the idea is there'll be a couple of shrubs. On the left hand side here I've got a cordyline, and that will eventually grow into a sort of like a palm tree shape. The idea of the cordyline is it's to give a hint of what's in the back garden, because the back garden is going to be fully tropical. On the right hand side just another Ricinus for now, but I'm going to put some kind of shrub in there, possibly an arbutelon sun tent which has nice blue flowers, but I'm still deciding what plant will go in there. But there'll definitely be a small shrub. Won't be getting a huge amount taller than what this Ricinus is at the moment. Just give a little bit of interest and a bit of height, and also a bit of privacy towards the house. And then when we come to the house itself, there's a semicircular bed. It's quite narrow and you can't really see it because I've kind of mulched all the surfaces with wood chips, so it sort of blends in. But there's basically tree lilies in here, Now this was the first year I grew them, so you can actually see they're very small. I'll put up some photos of what the flowers look like though, but they're very small at the moment. They're only about 2 or 3 foot in height at the most, probably just 2 foot to be honest. And these are supposed to get to about 8 foot tall eventually, so they're quite young bulbs. They'll probably size up over the next few years if they're quite happy with the soil here and the positioning. And hopefully by 2 or 3 years time we'll have some really big ones to be absolutely covered in flowers. Now also in this bed there is a row of Gladioli. I wasn't planning to put these in, but these came free with my bulb order, so I put loads of Gladioli in, and they did look quite nice over summer. But for now what I've done is I've planted it up with ornamental kale. These will come through, grow a bit more over the winter, give a bit of colour and greenery whilst everything else has died down. These go a really nice bright colour once it starts to get colder. You can see this one here, it's just starting to show some of that bright purple. I'll put up some photos though so you can see what it looked like last year when I grew these. They're really nice, colourful, ornamental, and in spring they do get covered in yellow flowers, so they look really nice. So it's pretty much the same on the other side of the semicircular bed. I did have a lot of nice sunflowers here. These have actually just mostly died back now. They've been flowering for a long time, and you can see the seed heads are just starting to go over. So these ones are almost finished, but I have got a very nice sunflower on the right here, which I'll show you later, which is my nicest specimen so far this year. And basically what I'm doing is I'm collecting the seeds, trying to grow my own variety of sunflower, and so far that's the nicest yet. So at the front, basically have a couple of buried chimney pots, which I think go to the ground. There's a big slab of concrete here, but I think they go through the concrete into the soil. So there's a rose at the right, which was always there. So I've just left that. It flowers quite nicely, that rose. On the left-hand pot, all that's in there is tulips that came with the house. So what I've done is I put a Ricinus plant in. This was the first one I planted out, and you can see it's grown the largest. It's also against the house where it's getting extra heat from the sun reflecting off the wall. So this one's grown really nicely. And the damage you do see is probably from the wind. It's more sheltered, but it's still caught the wind a little bit. So it's been good to see how well that's grown. It won't survive the winter, but it'll be interesting to see if it does survive a bit longer than the other Ricinus plants in the garden, just because it's got the extra shelter from the wall. And now the two favourite plants up here at the front are probably my Ensete bananas. These were actually grown from seed, and these were less than a year old. The seed was sown about January, February time. It didn't really germinate till March or April, so these are quite young plants. They were grown under grow lights for a couple of months inside and then planted out around June, July time, and they've really taken off since, and they've been in these barrels for the last half of the summer. Yeah, as you can see, they've really outgrown the barrels. They almost make the barrels look small, but these plants are just so big they make the barrels look small. It's hard to show you the sense of scale, but I'm 6'4", and my hands still look relatively small against the enormous leaves on these. So I've been really happy with how these are done. Now there is a slight difference between the two of them. I don't know if it's because the positions they're growing in or genetic variation as they were seed grown. This one tends to have a thinner stem. You can see it doesn't take up too much of the barrel there, but it has absolutely enormous leaves, and it's got fantastic red stripe as well. Both of them have fantastic red stripes on the leaves, but this one just a little bit better than the other. But the leaves on this one seem to be a lot larger. And if I go over to the other one now, you'll see the leaves tend to be a little bit smaller on this one, but the trunk itself takes up a lot more of the whiskey barrel. So this one is a lot stockier in comparison, but still looks really nice. It could be because it gets more light, and so it grows a bit more compact, whereas the one on the left here gets a little bit of shade from the house in the evening, and it also gets quite a lot of shade from the sunflowers in the afternoon. But generally both of these get full sun all morning right through to about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it's a nice sunny position for them. Lots of light reflected back off the windows and also from the white render of the house, so they've done really well. I'm surprised how big they've got considering we were North Scotland. But I won't go into too much detail with most of my bananas because I have recently done a video all about them, and I'll put a link in now. And if you want to see more about the bananas and how each individual plant is done, you can have a look at that. Now I've also got, as you can see, a lot of pelargoniums around the place. There's quite a few plants in the bed, so I've got these in the pots. I've also got several more on the windowsill over there behind the banana. These are ones I took cutting of last year, and they've done really well, especially the ones I put in the bed where they've had more root space. They're growing really nicely, so I'm going to try and overwinter some of these if I can, maybe as cuttings, I'm not sure. I don't need all of them because there's so many of them, and also a bit struggling for space for frost-free areas. Now these can take -1, -2 without too much issue, but if there's a hard frost, I need to find somewhere good for them to be sheltered. So this is my big sunflower that I'd like to show you. So with the sunflowers, basically I had a packet of seeds. They all grew completely differently to how they were supposed to grow in the packet. Basically they were supposed to be 6 foot tall. Most of them grew more like 3.5 meters in height, multiple branches as well, and became absolutely monster sunflowers. So the biggest and best one last year, collected the seeds, and what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to select 2 different varieties, a branching dwarf variety from my parents' garden, and in my garden I'm just breeding the biggest and most branched possible. So this year these are all from the same batch of seeds. You can see these are a lot smaller, and they're not huge plants. Also, they don't seem to be lasting as long. They're going over quite quickly. This one's the best so far, so I'm definitely collecting the seeds from this. This is more what I'm looking for. And this is just one sunflower plant. You can see all the side branches. Now, it was quite a lot taller. You can see just at the top there, it did snap off in the wind. You can see the point where it snapped. So this was actually higher than the gutter up there. It was probably another meter or so in height. So it is a really tall sunflower, even though it's not as tall now. But what I like about it is how much it's branched. You can see all these side branches coming off it right down to the base. And each side branch then puts on its own side branches, which has plenty of flowers. So it tends to flower at the end with one large flower like this. Then it puts out several smaller sunflowers. And then as it ages, some of these side branches further down even become more branches. You can see it more on this one down here, where it's growing some more side branches there. So basically it's a very branched appearance, and because it keeps branching, it doesn't ever seem to stop growing. It will eventually come to a point where it runs out of options for branching, but basically as long as I keep deadheading this will keep going right into the frosts. Whereas the other ones, they branch, but they don't branch as often, so once they've run out of growing points, they just kind of finish and die. Whereas this one has a lot more growing points, so it lasts a lot longer. And what I'm trying to do is breed a sunflower that has as many growing points as possible. Then hopefully it would last in a frost-free climate for maybe a year or so, and be an absolutely huge, almost like tree-like flowering plant. So this is the best so far. It's looking particularly good at the moment, despite how late it is in the year and the frosts and also the high winds. I have had to keep it very well staked. But I'm quite happy with how this one's doing so far. So the only other plants at the front really are these Shoo fly plants. These are actually self-seeded. I didn't plant them, but I quite like the flowers, so I've left them. Luckily it's the morning, so you can actually see them. The flowers tend to go over by the afternoon. They're not very big flowers, but they are quite nice, and they do produce new ones every day. Each flower only lasts about a day normally, but they're constantly producing new ones, so it does give a nice display. I also like it because it has massive foliage. Now, this time of year it's only got the small leaves, but what tends to happen is the first leaves that come up before it flowers are really large, even bigger than this. I think most of them have fallen off, unfortunately, but they do have giant leaves. It looks quite tropical. And these are looking quite bad at the moment because these can't take low temperatures very well. So we had that touch of frost. You can see it's damaged quite a lot of the leaves. The newer growth has come through okay because that frost was probably about a week or so ago. So the new growth is coming through fresh, but as it's the end of October, we'll probably have a hard frost soon, and that will kill this off. But it's interesting to see most of the tropical plants, like the Ricinus and the bananas and the gingers, touch of frost hasn't damaged them yet. But with the Shoo fly plant, it was about 2 degrees, but there was definitely frost forming on the cars, so it wasn't what they call an air frost, but it was a ground frost, so that was just enough to damage the leaves on these, and you'll see more in the back garden. So on the way to the back garden, I'll show you quickly my bin shelter. This is still work in progress. Basically this will have a green roof on it and hopefully green walls as well. Probably put the green walls in later because there's a lot of material needed for the walls, but I'll be putting the green roof on this winter and into spring. I'll give you guys an update on that probably next year. So going into the back garden, it's quite messy at the moment. Basically I've got a lot of renovation work done in the house and I've not finished planting up the garden, so it's looking a bit messy, but I'd like to give you a tour anyway, show you how it's doing. So this section is the only real section I've actually planted up and done any work on. I've done a few videos on this already, so you can search through my channel to find the videos about the bananas, the gingers, and just generally planting up this bed. But it was a mixture of shrubs and a lawn, and I've just completely cleared the site, improved the soil as much as possible, and it's now looking quite nice. So I've been surprised at how well the tropical plants have done. I'm in North Scotland, it's quite windy here and it's quite low temperatures as well, but the plants seem to have done particularly well despite all the conditions that we have here. Now, as I say, it is very windy here in North Scotland, but I'm quite lucky. There's a lot of houses near me, a lot of trees, so I don't get the worst winds. So there is a bit of wind damage, but it's not as bad as it is in some places nearby. So you can see here there are some ripped leaves on the top of the bananas and also some snapped leaves such as that one there and this one here, which was completely snapped off. and just hanging on by a thread now, but generally I've been really impressed with how everything's done. So I'll go through most of these plants quickly now. It will be quite a long video, but I'll just skip over most of the banana things because I went through the bananas in depth, so you can see that on another video. But at least you can see how much they've grown since that last one. I did that video about a month ago. I thought that would be the last update I'd do on them, because normally September time we get hard frosts and it kills off anything that's tropical. But luckily this year it's been much milder than normal, and the tropical plants are still doing surprisingly well. So in this bed, some of the biggest plants, obvious to point out, are the Ricinus plants. These are all from the same packet of seeds, but there's a little bit of variation, as you always get with seed grown plants. So some of them are a bit more green. This should be more of a bronzy colour, but it's nice to have a bit of variation. Let's see how they're doing. So at the front here, the other big interesting plant is this one over here, which is my Zantedeschia. This variety is called Hercules. This was a tiny little leaf when I first got it, and that was less than a year ago, and it's grown into this massive plant already. This will eventually grow up to 6 or 7 feet in height in the right position. It won't grow that tall here because it's quite sunny in this position, but I'm going to move it into a shadier part of the garden where it will encourage it to grow larger leaves and taller flowers. So there's 2 big flowers coming at the moment. These will get quite a lot larger. They're still growing. They'll probably get up to about 5 feet or so in this position if the frost doesn't kill them back before that. And this is moderately hardy. The leaves will probably survive a light frost, but then the hard frost, it'll die down to the ground. I'll mulch it and it should survive okay in there. But I really like this plant. It's grown so quickly for me. It's got this really nice white flecks on it, and it's got that kind of arum family tropical style leaf, so it looks really good in a tropical border. And you get the nice bonus of having these giant canna lilies, which when I cut and take inside actually lasts about a month or 2, so they're really long lasting flowers. Just a really nice plant, so I'm glad to have got that one. Some other plants at the front here. One that will become probably the biggest in the bed eventually, but at the moment is only a little baby, is my Trachycarpus palmer here. So it looks completely smothered at the moment. Most of the summer it was actually out in the open, but then all the other plants are growing around it, so it's now smothered. Then over winter and spring this will be out in the open again, and then it'll get smothered come midsummer. But it should get enough light for most of the summer, and that will get quite large. You can see I planted it quite far away from the border of the garden. That's because that could grow up to 2 meters wide eventually, has quite large leaves, and will fill up a lot of that bed, so I've needed to give that the extra space. It's generally not the fastest growing plant, but I'm hoping with really good soil conditions it'll hopefully get up to maybe 6 foot in maybe 6 years or so. It tends to only grow about a foot a year. So I'll take you now around to the side of the garden so you get a different view. So here you can mainly see the bananas. I've got three different types here. I've got an Ensete ventricosum, which isn't technically a banana, and that's the same species as the ones at the front, but this is a bred variety called maurelii, so it has that nice dark burgundy leaves. This was grown from a plant, as this doesn't grow true from seed, so that was just a very small plant in spring. That's grown quite well, but not as well as my green varieties. And then the other bananas here, all the ones over here are my sikkimensis bananas, my Musa sikkimensis. This is a hardy banana. It grows in high altitude areas, so it can handle cooler temperatures, and it's frost hardy at the roots if it's well mulched. These were grown from seed, and considering these were quite small when they're planted out, they're about probably 9 or 10 months old. They're really quite big already, so I'm quite impressed with how well they've grown. They're also sending up little suckers. You can see a baby down there, and this one over here has actually got 2 babies starting to come. I'm really impressed with how quickly they're growing even in my cool climate, and these are probably my favourite bananas at the moment, and it'll be good to see how big they can get next year if the frost doesn't kill them. And then the only other banana I have in here is my Musa basjoo, which is quite a well-known banana. This is one of the hardiest bananas in the world. This one, even the stem can probably survive maybe -5. I find it doesn't look quite as nice in my opinion. The leaves are a bit floppy and they're a bit paler green. Also, it doesn't seem to grow quite as quickly in my climate as Musa sikkimensis does, but it does send out loads of suckers. There's actually probably about 5 little babies coming out from the base, and even the babies are quite big now. But this is very root hardy at the ground level. So even with -20, if I mulch this well, it should be fine. It shouldn't really suffer too much damage. It might lose the stem, but the roots will probably survive as long as it's well mulched. So that's the main tall plants. I will talk about one other later on, but I'd like to talk about the ground cover now. So I've planted several canna lilies. Now, I thought originally these might have viruses. This one might still have canna virus, I'm not sure. But generally they've been growing out of that weird kind of foliage. So they might not have canavirus. What I'll do is I'll wait till next spring. If they have canavirus marks, then I'll take them out and get rid of them. Otherwise I'll leave them, but I've not been too impressed with them. They've been growing quite slow. I think my climate is just a bit cold for them. These two are dwarfs. I've got some taller ones at the back which have done a little better. But generally all these canna lilies have been looking pretty poorly, and I think maybe it's just a little bit too cold here in this part of North Scotland. So another plant that I really like that's done well is the Oxalis triangularis here. Now this was a house plant I've had for years. I divided it up, and each one of these large plants here was just 1 or 2 bulbs. I did a video about that previously in spring which you can watch, and basically I just separated the plant, put 1 or 2 bulbs in each pot. Once the pot clumped up a little bit, I planted it out in the garden, and it's just really taken off, and you can see it's got loads of flowers, been flowering constantly, lovely dark purple foliage. It's just done really well here in the full sunlight. I think because my sunlight's quite weak here in North Scotland, but this full sunlight seems to have brought out that lovely dark purple colour. I've got one that's in a shadier spot, hasn't grown quite as much, and it's a bit more of a green colour, but it's a very adaptable plant. It can handle high light levels and also handle low light levels, so I'm using that as an understory plant which can kind of mingle in amongst the other plants. But one of my favourite understory plants so far has been my begonia. I've got hardy begonias here. I'll try and show you a nice specimen that's in flower at the moment. So these have been amazing for the amount of growth they put on. This is a begonia called Begonia grandis, and the variety is Sapporo. So this is, I think this one's from the northern island of Japan, and it's basically a hardy begonia. It should be able to take frost down to about -5. Now I will collect some material to keep inside over winter just in case it does die in my garden, but it should be hardy if I keep it well mulched. And also it has these little bulbules that are formed, and it can grow back from them. So each clump that you see here was just 1 bulbule back in spring. I've got a video that you can watch about that, and basically they were just tiny little bulbules. There's one forming here which I can show you for a reference of how big they were. They're basically about this size here. They form these little bulbules in autumn. You can pick them and then grow them from that. So every clump was originally this tiny little thing down here, and they've clumped up nicely into quite decent plants. So I'm really happy with how these done. Also, to have begonia that's hardy is a great bonus, as there's not many hardy begonias out there. But they've done really well, and they're clumping up nice. Lots of little bulbules starting to form at the base. So I'll be collecting these later on. You can see them just at the bottom there. And hopefully these will come back next year, and they have actually flowered quite well also. So I'll now take you into the back of the bed and show you the gingers and a few of the other plants I've got back here. Now on the right hand side I've got 2 large canna lilies. These haven't really flowered very well for me. They had a couple of flowers this summer, you can see the old flower head there, but they've just not really done that well. I think cannas just don't seem to do well in my climate. But what has done well is the Hedychiums or Hedychium hardy gingers. So this is the Wardii variety, that's a Telstar hybrid. The Wardii is my favourite so far. Massive glossy leaves, it's really bulked up well. These were tiny plants in spring, just basically tiny little sticks, 1 tiny piece of tuber, and they've really sprouted up nice. And I've already divided these once already, just to keep some indoors in case these don't survive the winter. But they're doing really well, nice tropical appearance, and because these have done so well, I'm actually going to get a few more Hedychiums this winter, plant them out in spring and expand my Hedychium collection, because I really liked how they've done. And this one has even flowered just slightly this year, and it has another flower trying to form there, but it'll be too cold, so that won't actually flower this year. But even if I don't get flowers, I just love them for that tropical appearance, because you don't get anything like that growing in Scotland normally, so it's just nice to get that nice kind of tropical ginger appearance. So another plant that'll be one of the biggest here eventually is this one here, which at the moment is probably the most uninteresting plant of them all, and it's basically this dead stick looking stick, and that's my Paulownia tree. This is a hybrid Paulownia, so it should grow even faster than a normal Paulownia. This is grown from seed. It's only grown about 1 foot in its first year, but it's been putting a lot of energy into its root system. I've done a video all about these previously, so you can watch that. But basically, they put most of their energy into the root system for the first year. This should really take off next year. I'll have giant foliage. You can actually see some of the leaves here. They drop off when they're green as soon as the cold temperatures come. So I don't have any autumn colour, but they have giant tropical looking leaves, and they should be getting the size of dustbin lids eventually. So that'll be a really interesting one to see how it does. I've seen them growing in Scotland before, but they've never really grown too well. It is a little bit cold in our climate, although they can survive the winters, the summers are a bit cool for it. So I'll see how it does. Certainly my other plants have done well here, which I didn't expect to grow well, so hopefully that does okay. And then one of my biggest star attractions of this bed is probably this plant here. This is my Dahlia imperialis. It's a type of tree dahlia. This again was a tiny little stick that I got back in January, February time, didn't do much until March. Then it just had explosive growth from then, and it has pretty much grown non-stop ever since. Now the top did get broken off when it was transferred outside, and it lost all its leaves because of the shock with going out into a sunnier environment. And then basically it responded by sending out loads of side shoots, and it's formed this enormous plant that we have here. It's probably 7 or 8 foot at the moment, really tall. Now it does flower in the wild, lovely big pink flowers. Anywhere with warm autumns and mild winters it will probably flower, but here in Scotland it definitely won't. So this will get killed soon by the frost, because normally it would flower around late November, early December time, but by then it's going to be hard frosts here. And even if there isn't a hard frost, the temps will be so low it'll be growing too slowly to fully form flowers. So at the moment there's no sign of flowering, but I just like it for the sheer size of it and all these massive foliage, and also the fact it can grow so big so quickly. So as I say, this one is only really all grown this in 1 year, for a tiny little shoot. And you can see there how big the stem has got already. It's an enormous trunk, just like a tree. I'll be interested to see how it does next year. Although this will be cut down to the ground by the frost, I'll probably try and insulate a little bit of the trunk, see if it grows better from the trunk or from a new shoot from the ground. And it should have absorbed a lot of energy and put it into its tubers this year, so hopefully next year it'll come up even faster, and I'm hoping to get even larger plant by the end of summer. So this is the other side of the tree dahlia, and what I've done here is I've grafted a normal dahlia onto the tree dahlia. I've done a whole video about this which you can watch on my channel, but basically just to see how it would do, see if the extra vigour from the tree dahlia would benefit it. It has grown a bit better than it would in its own rootstock. Still got a bad case of powdery mildew, unfortunately. None of the disease resistance from the tree dahlia has transferred, because you can see the tree dahlia is completely free of powdery mildew, but the grafted one has got powdery mildew on it. But it's grown really well. The flower's about the same size as normal, but it's generally just been a lot thicker and healthier than it would have done on its own root system. And I'll show you the graft around here. It's right in amongst there. That's the graft section. So the green section is the tree dahlia at the bottom, and then the brown bit at the top is the bit above the graft, which is just like a normal garden dahlia. And that's done quite well, so I'll definitely be doing that again next year, trying a few more experimental grafts. So I think that's all the plants in the tropical garden. Panning around, the rest of the garden hasn't really been touched at all. I've cleared all the large shrubs that were here, and there's an old pear tree as well, but pears, they don't really ripen well in Scotland, so I got rid of the pear tree, and I've just left the apple and the plum at the back. I've also trimmed the hedge because the hedge was really out of shape. You see there's a lot of bare patches, so it'll take a while for that to get into good condition. And the rest of this was just grass, and I've basically just covered it with black plastic to kill the grass off, get it ready for planting next year, and also just to keep my work level down. So I've got a few building materials, some mulch as well lying around, so it's quite a mess unfortunately. We've got another shoo fly plant that self-seeded. This was absolutely enormous. I couldn't get past my path, so I did have to cut this back. I wasn't bothered about it covering my path as I just went around it, but it started smothering my Ensete at the end there, so I had to cut it right back. But you can see the size of the stems. It was quite a monster, really big plant. So I'll be probably growing more of them from seed next year. I always like growing these shoo fly plants. And then the rest of the site, the bit at the back with the grass, that will eventually be a section where I build a studio shed once I have the budget for it. At the moment it's just a little composting site in the corner there, and there will be a composting site behind the studio shed in the future, but that's basically just waiting for me to get the budget and the time to build the studio shed. And this other area is a bit of a nursery kind of section for me at the moment, just using the black plastic as a good kind of staging ground for my plants. So I've got a couple of bamboo plants here that I've grown from seed about 5 or 6 years ago, which are looking quite nice, and I might use them to replace the Ensetes over winter in the front garden in the big whiskey barrels, just to give a bit of colour and a bit of greenery over the winter months. I've also got my bonsai here, which is a larch bonsai. I've done a few update videos about this, probably about once a year I do one, but this is probably the first time I've shown it in its nice autumn colours, so it's looking at its best at the moment actually, with these really nice kind of oranges and yellows. And this year was the first year it's actually grown some pine cones, so it was nice to get that added feature there. Well, I shouldn't call them pine cones because it's not a pine tree, it's a larch. So there's lovely larch cones there, so I'm really happy with how that looks. And then on the left I've just got some rocket just for eating in the house, a few more plants that I'm getting growing for next year, such as my Verbena bonariensis down here, and a few geraniums as well. I've got loads of paulownia seedlings down here as well, which I've just been growing from a batch of seeds, so there's quite a few more. These are the smallest ones. The biggest ones are over here. I'm basically growing them see what the different varieties they get, because there's a lot of variation in them. I've done a video about them previously where you can see how much they vary in each way, but one of the examples is this one. There's two here that are flowering already, which is quite unusual for them to flower in their first year. Normally it takes them a few years to flower. So the only other sections really are probably the greenhouse and the section at the back. But first of all, there's the bamboo plant here, which is a Phylostachys orosulcata spectabilis, which is a nice, it's almost a timber bamboo. It's in the right genus, but it doesn't get quite big enough to really be classed as a timber bamboo, but it is large. It should grow to about 5 or 6 meters, and it's got lovely cane color. At the moment it's not showing it too well, but basically it should be bright yellow with a green stripe. Now this has got root mealybug at the moment, so it is struggling. Even though it's grown so much bigger than it was originally. It was just one cane. You can see it in the middle. When I got it last winter, I think it was around February time, it was just this tiny cane here, about 1 foot in height, and it's grown all these other canes since. There's probably almost 6 foot tall now, so it's definitely grown a huge amount. I'm really looking forward to planting this in the garden next year and seeing how it does, and that'll just make a nice kind of backdrop to the garden, form some privacy, and just give it a bit of shelter as well. So going forward, I've got this kind of area that looks like a wasteland in the corner. What this is a no dig, no maintenance vegetable garden. I've done a video, but I probably won't be releasing that until a few more months. Basically, all I've done is planted potatoes, butternut squash, and what you can see here is the Jerusalem artichokes. I plant them in spring, give it a heavy mulch, and then there's no weeding and there's no maintenance at all, doesn't need water really, and I just leave it, and then come winter I've got loads of roots under the ground which I can harvest all winter long. So it's a good way to get a load of food produced without any effort. So that's basically what this section is now. It looks quite messy because apart from cutting a few tops off when the winds got really strong, I've not done any work on it. So there's 1 or 2 weeds, but generally with the mulch and with the plants smothering everything, it's kind of kept weed free. You can't see any of the potatoes because they've all died back already. You can see maybe some of the dead stems just down there where there's a couple of stems left, and you can see the what they call the potato apples, or basically the fruits that look like tomatoes on the surface, but there's a lot of potatoes under there as well as all the Jerusalem artichokes. So the last part of the tour I'd like to show you is my greenhouse here. The greenhouse needs a lot of work. It came with the house, and was part of the attraction of getting the house was the greenhouse, because I've always wanted a greenhouse. But this is in really bad shape. It hasn't got any worse since I've had it, but it always had a lot of panes of glass missing. One of the first things I had to do when I moved to this house was actually remove all the broken glass from around the ground, because there was loads of glass everywhere. But basically I need to get this renovated hopefully this winter, because I'd like to get a lot of plants in here sheltered over winter, as my conservatory is a bit small for all the plants. But we'll just see, it's budget wise at the moment that's restricting me. I can get a load of polycarbonate quite cheap and quite easy, which is these panels here, and there's already one of them in there. But as most of it's glass, I would like to try and go for glass, but you can't order glass online because it just breaks in transit. And the other issue is the curved panels here are extremely expensive. There's 2 that need replacing on this side, but on the other side there's maybe 4 or 5 that need replacing. So I'm just saving up a bit more, and then hopefully this winter I'll get this renovated. I can use that to shelter my plants. So I have been using it this year. I'm using it more as like a dry area. You can see, as I say, there's 3 panels missing from there, and there's quite a few panels missing from up at the top as well, that triangle. So it doesn't really hold the temperature very well, but what it does do is keep the rain off the plants, and it stops the wind quite well. So this is kind of a sheltered area. I've got some bedding plants which will be going out later. My Senetes, which I've cut back, and they're starting to green up nicely. I've also got a Tetrapanix there, which I'll be growing in the tropical style garden next year. And I was struggling for where to keep all my peppers this year, so I had a load of pepper plants and chilies. And when I had my wedding, I had to be away from the house for about a week, so I couldn't look after the plants or water them. So I just planted them all in this bed just to keep them watered, so they can put the roots into the soil. They wouldn't need to be watered regularly. And they've done okay. They've not done amazing because it's not hot in here. It doesn't get warm. And Scotland's a bit cool to be growing peppers outside. But I've still got loads of peppers. You can see loads of chilies there. There's been far too many for me to harvest, which is why they're all kind of drying out on the plants. But I've been quite happy with the harvest anyway, and they should do really well in here next year if I grow them again, but actually have glass on it. And coming further back, I've got the last 2 plants I'll show you in this tour. This are my 2 Moso Bamboos. Now these have been growing really nicely in the conservatory all summer, but once I've transferred them outside, they've started to get a bit of windburn. They're not looking so happy. They don't really like the colder conditions. But you can see they're quite big plants now. I'm really looking forward to seeing how these do next year. The one at the back, as I said in the previous video, is growing quite differently to this one. That one is growing taller canes and less of them, whereas this one seems to be growing a lot more canes and they tend to be a lot shorter. So you can see the difference in the foliage there. Also, although this one had darker leaves and was doing better inside, it's actually looking a bit worse now it's outside, and the one at the back, those leaves are surviving the cooler temperatures better. So we'll see how well they do over winter. I'll keep them in the polytunnel without any protection, but if it's really hard, below -5, -10, -15, then I'll be taking these indoors just to protect them from the hardest of frosts. So that's just about it for the end of season tour of the garden. What I'll be doing in this section here, I'll be fleecing it whenever there's a mild frost. So you can see I've got these canes up here. I've fleeced it a couple of times already, and that just keeps the mild frost from damaging any of the foliage. But now it's so late in the year, I suspect the hard frost will come soon. What will happen then is once the leaves get killed off from the first hard frost, I'll then cut all the leaves off. Any of the plants that are annual, I'll cut them down to the ground. The bananas will then get insulated, especially the ground parts, so that the roots survive, but I'll also try and insulate the trunks, see if I can keep some height on the bananas. So I'll be making an insulation video and protection video for these tropical plants then. The tree dahlia unfortunately will have to get killed almost down to the ground. There's no way I can insulate a plant that large, and I'm not even fleecing that one at the moment with the cold nights because it's just too big. So that's what's going to happen with this one. Really deep mulch basically, keep everything well insulated, and hopefully most of these plants should survive through to the winter. The only ones that don't really need any insulation would be the Paulownia tree and the Trachycarpus palm, because they're pretty hardy plants. And then going back into the rest of the garden, I'll just give you a quick update on my plans for this area. I think I probably told you in a previous video, but the idea is the back would be the studio shed. I was going to build it this year, but the timber prices have more than doubled, so I've had to delay that. Hopefully next summer, or maybe even spring, I might get the budget for building it then, and that will just give me a much nicer filming space. I'm also going to plant a bamboo area at the back with my Moso Bamboo and my Phylostachys or also Castor bamboo to give that nice screening at the back and protection. But again, the bamboo barrier costs about £100 for that whole area, so that's a big job. One I'll do in the winter and one once I've got the more budget. And then next spring, what I'll be doing is hopefully this whole section here will be planted up. This is also going to be a tropical style garden, but it's not going to be like true tropical. So the idea with this bed is all the plants in here need a lot of protection over winter. I put them all into the same bed so I can just keep the whole lot well mulched and well insulated. It's easier to manage it all in the one spot. But over on the left hand side here, this will be the plants that look tropical, but they can actually survive my winters no problem. So these plants won't need as much protection, so I can just have them scattered around. I don't need to focus all my efforts into them too much. I can just let them fend for themselves. So there'll be a real mixture. Most of this black area where the fabric is at the moment, that will be the kind of tropical looking bed, but hardier plants. And also I'll be putting in some of my favourite plants as well, just to mix them in, because it's not just tropical plants I want to grow, I also want to grow my favourite plants in here also. And then on the left here, which will probably be 2 or 3 years time because patios are expensive, is I'll be putting a nice patio here just so I have a nice area to sit. This is northeast facing, so in summer the sun sets and it really lights up this area nicely, and this wall gets really nice and warm against the conservatory. So an example of how much the weather changes here, in December the sun will set around about here. It won't really come above that house at the end there, so it's never any sun in this garden in December, especially as during the day we've got the high roof there from the house, so it's really well shaded. In summer though, this back garden's really sunny. The sun will come right over. For a lot of the summer it will set around about here, but in midsummer it will actually set around about there. So it's really sunny, the sun comes down. I'll have a really nice sunny patio where I can sit out in the summer, and I'll also be putting in large planters or maybe some large pots, and maybe have my brugmansia outside, just some of my more tender tropicals that need to come in the winter in a pot in the conservatory. I can then grow them in a pot outside in this nice warm section and bring them in when they need it. But that'll be a few years time, just have a nice large patio out here, and then the rest will all be jungle style. And eventually I would like to put some fencing up just to give a bit more shelter, because at the moment the garden is still a little bit open, and the problem with this hedge is although it gives a lot of shelter, it takes out a huge amount of nutrients and water from the soil. So anything I plant along there is going to be very dry, poor soil, and it's not going to grow so well. So eventually I probably will get rid of that hedge, but for now I'll be keeping it until I get the budget to actually build a proper fence and have that nicely sheltered without all the drying of the soil. So that's all for this update on my tropical plants and the garden tour in general. I'll probably do another tour in spring when things are starting to come back to life, and it'll be interesting to see how many of these tropicals can survive the winter. I will be protecting them as best as I can, but I don't think I'll have a 100% success rate, but hopefully I will.